Story 1. As the relentless sun scorched the vast, seemingly boundless Syrian desert, I, Captain John Hawkins, stood steadfastly by the colossal MTT truck. My gaze was fixed on the meticulous loading of vital communication equipment. The air was filled with the gruff shouts of the loaders, a cacophony that underscored the significance of our task. Each crate, especially the large one that was the centerpiece of our cargo, was handled with a reverence that bordered on the religious. This crate, sealed tightly and peppered with mysterious holes, piqued my curiosity, but protocol in the stern, looks from the overseeing government officials, kept my questions at bay. Among these officials, several individuals in nondescript civilian attire stood out. They kept their eyes hawk-like on the cargo, particularly the enigmatic large crate, suggesting its contents were of extraordinary value. Our mission was deceptively simple, yet of paramount importance. Transport cargo from the ancient, storied city of Palmyra to Deir ez-Zor, a journey that, under normal circumstances, would take about 6 hours along the M20 highway. However, these were not normal circumstances. The route cut straight through the heart of the Syrian desert, a land infamous for its unforgiving heat, sudden and blinding sandstorms, and the ever-present threat of ambushes by local bandits. It was a land that tested the mettle of even the most seasoned travelers. Thus, our squad of 10, bolstered by the presence of 5 government officials, was tasked with ensuring the safe passage of this mysterious cargo. Our preparations had been thorough. Each member of the team was a seasoned veteran, handpicked for their expertise and experience in such high-risk operations. The air was thick with tension, a silent acknowledgement of the dangers that lay ahead. The final piece of equipment was secured with a resounding click, signaling the end of our preparations and the beginning of our perilous journey. I made my way to my designated vehicle, the heart of our convoy. The truck was an imposing beast, its engine rumbling like distant thunder. Inside, I was joined by Lieutenant Smith, a man of few words but unshakable composure, and Mr. Jefferson, a tall, enigmatic figure from the government whose age seemed hard to place. He carried himself with an air of authority that demanded respect. Our convoy was a formidable sight. Leading and trailing were 2 heavily armored MRAPs, their mounted machine guns casting ominous shadows. Our truck, carrying the precious cargo, was sandwiched securely in the middle. Flanking us were a couple of sleek SUVs, their tinted windows hiding the government officials who were as much a mystery as the cargo we were transporting. The journey began with the slow, lumbering movement of our convoy out of the private courtyard, where the loading had taken place. We passed an old Arab stone house, its architecture a testament to the region's rich history. Its high, narrow windows overlooked an inner courtyard, where a once vibrant fountain now lay silent, a mute witness to the passage of time and the stories it carried. The local children, their faces a mixture of curiosity and awe, clustered along the road, their excited chatter and pointing fingers a brief, heartening distraction from the weight of our mission. As we left the confines of civilization, the terrain shifted. The road became a mere dirt track, a precursor to the vast, open desert that lay ahead. The landscape around us was a tapestry of extremes, endless dunes that rose and fell like the waves of a petrified ocean, their golden hues ever changing with the sun's position. Here and there, hardy shrubs clung to life, their existence a defiant stand against the harsh, arid climate. The air was thick and hot, a tangible presence that seemed to press against us with an almost physical weight. The sky was a relentless expanse of blue, unmarred by clouds, its vastness a reminder of our insignificance in the face of nature's grandeur. The silence of the desert was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the loading area. It was a silence that spoke volumes, filled with the whispers of ancient sands and the secrets they held. In this desolate expanse, the sun was a merciless overseer, its rays beating down upon us with an intensity that seemed to penetrate to the very core. The heat was more than just a physical sensation. It was an ever-present force, an adversary we had to contend with every moment. The shimmering heat haze on the horizon danced and distorted the landscape, creating mirages that toyed with our senses. Our convoy trudged along, a metallic beast crawling through the ancient sands. Inside the truck, the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio were the only sounds that pierced the overwhelming silence. The atmosphere was one of solemn anticipation, each of us lost in our own thoughts, mentally preparing for the journey ahead. I glanced at Mr. Jefferson, who sat stoically, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His demeanor was an enigma, calm yet unreadable, adding another layer of mystery to our mission. Lieutenant Smith, ever the professional, kept his focus on the road, his hands steady on the wheel despite the rough terrain. As we approached the M20 highway, the landscape began to change subtly. The endless dunes gave way to flatter, more navigable terrain, though the oppressive heat and the blinding brightness of the sun remained constant companions. The highway itself, a lifeline cutting through the desert, stretched out before us, a ribbon of tarmac that represented both our path forward and the challenges that lay ahead. I broke the silence, my voice sounding strangely loud in the confines of the truck. "Mr. Jefferson, this cargo we're transporting, can you tell us anything about it?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. He turned his gaze to me, his eyes revealing nothing. "It's just equipment, Captain. Nothing for you to worry about," he replied, his voice even and unemotional. I nodded, though his response did little to quell my curiosity. Beside me, Lieutenant Smith opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. He turned his attention back to the road, a silent acknowledgement that some questions were better left unasked. As we merged onto the highway, our speed increased, the convoy settling into a steady rhythm. The landscape blurred past us, a monotonous blend of sand and sky. As the relentless sun bore down upon us, our convoy, a line of dust-covered vehicles, wound its way through the Syrian desert. The silence inside the truck was as dense as the heat outside. Only the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio broke the monotonous drone. I sat deep in thought, my gaze occasionally drifting to the barren, sun-bleached landscape that stretched endlessly on either side of the highway. A fleeting glimpse of a desert fox, a rare sight in these arid lands, momentarily captured our attention as it darted across the road. Its russet fur was a stark contrast against the pale sands, a fleeting moment of life in an otherwise lifeless expanse. It was in this moment that Mr. Jefferson chose to speak. "Captain, how long have you served in Syria?" he asked, his voice smooth yet carrying an undercurrent of curiosity. "Nearly a year, sir," I replied, maintaining a professional demeanor. He nodded thoughtfully before delving into a topic seemingly unrelated to our current task. "You must have had extensive contact with the locals. Have you ever heard about the wild asses that once roamed here?" he inquired. His question caught me off guard. "No, sir, I haven't. My focus has been elsewhere," I responded, slightly puzzled by the sudden shift in conversation. Clearly, the Syrian wild ass, Equus hemionus hemipus, a subspecies of the wild ass, once inhabited the Middle East. Smaller and more resilient than its counterparts, adapted to the arid desert conditions, it struggled to survive. Yet despite its efforts, it became extinct, succumbed to hunting and habitat loss. Humans are cold and merciless, and in the war against them, one must either hide from them or adapt to become useful, to not interfere. This is the path to survival. The Arabs have a legend. In the endless deserts of the Middle East, caravans whispered legends of a ghoul named Zahira. She was a night creature, a twisted echo of her former human self. Zahira lived in the ruins of ancient cities, luring unsuspecting travelers with the guise of a young, seductive woman. Those who succumbed to her charms ended up in her lair, never to return. It is said Zahira was once a princess who fell victim to a curse for her pride and cruelty. Transformed into a ghoul, she roamed battlefields and graveyards, feeding on the dead. She could transform into various forms, often appearing as a hyena or reverting to human form to deceive her prey. The only way to defeat Zahira was with a single, decisive weapon strike. A second strike would revive her. I listened, intrigued yet wary. "An interesting story," I finally said, trying to gauge his intention behind sharing such a tale. Mr. Jefferson's response was a thin smile. "Imagine if the wild asses had adapted like Zahira. Would they have met the same fate? Adaptation, Captain. is the key to survival. And perhaps it's not just the domain of rats and cockroaches, he mused, his smile widening just a fraction. The conversation dwindled, leaving me to ponder his words. I reflexively checked my pistol, a habit ingrained from years of service. His talk of mythical creatures and the parallels he drew with our mission left me unsettled. I felt a sudden dryness in my throat and reached for my water flask, unscrewing the cap and taking a long sip. But then, a sound from behind, a distinct thud, made me choke on the water, coughing as I hastily turned around. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but all I saw was the dusty road and the convoy trailing us. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. Lieutenant Smith, our driver, gave a brief nod, his expression tense. Mr. Jefferson, however, remained calm, almost unnervingly so. After a brief silence, he simply said, "Pay it no mind." His nonchalance did little to ease my growing sense of unease. What were we carrying in this convoy that warranted such secrecy and protection? Before I could probe further, the unexpected happened. The vehicle ahead came to a sudden, grinding halt, sending a jolt through our truck as we braked hard. Without hesitation, I grabbed my rifle and exited the truck. My eyes scanned the surroundings, the stark, unyielding desert offering no clues. The heat was a palpable force, waves of it distorting the air and blending the horizon into a mirage. The road, once a symbol of connection and progress, now resembled a war-torn landscape, riddled with deep craters and littered with debris. Massive chunks of asphalt lay scattered like the remnants of some forgotten battle, a stark reminder of the conflict that had ravaged this land. My eyes surveyed the destruction, a knot of apprehension tightening in my gut. Lieutenant Harris, leading the convoy in the first vehicle, approached me with a grave expression that mirrored my concern. "Captain, this route is impassable," he stated, pointing to the ravaged highway. "Our best option is to detour through the desert and loop back to the road further on." His voice carried the weight of experience, one honed in the crucible of countless missions. The desert, though seemingly empty, was fraught with hidden dangers. Mines could be buried beneath the innocent-looking sands, and the occasional scrubby bushes provided ideal cover for insurgents. I scanned the horizon, the vast expanse of sand stretching out in every direction, feeling the weight of the decision upon me. It was then that Mr. Jefferson, the enigmatic government official who had been a constant presence of mystery, joined our discussion. His gaze lingered on the devastated road before us. "We need to move quickly, Captain," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "We don't have the luxury of time. Take the detour." His words brooked no argument, and I could sense an underlying importance in his tone that went beyond our immediate predicament. Reluctantly, I issued the order. A scout vehicle moved ahead, cautiously navigating the treacherous off-road terrain while we maintained a safe distance. The journey was jarring. The vehicle shook violently as it traversed the uneven desert. Amidst the tumultuous ride, the mysterious thumping from the cargo area returned, more insistent than before. I cast a questioning glance at Mr. Jefferson, frustration edging my voice. "What in God's name are we carrying?" His response was curt, delivered with a commanding authority that brooked no further inquiry. "Ignore it, Captain. That's an order." His words echoed in my mind as we continued our journey. The soldiers around me shared looks of unease, each man battling his own thoughts and fears. Eventually, we navigated the rough terrain and rejoined the highway. The soldiers' tension was palpable, eyes constantly roving, hands gripping their weapons a little tighter. The gunners swiveled ceaselessly, vigilant against any potential threat. Despite the ever-present danger, we encountered no further obstacles and accelerated along the highway. The road ahead stretched into the distance, flanked by small cliffs and mountains that heralded a more dangerous terrain. The looming canyons were notorious for their treacherous turns and hidden crevices, perfect for ambushes. As we entered a narrow canyon, the towering rock walls closed in around us, their imposing presence casting long, dark shadows across our path. The canyon was a stark, rugged beauty, its walls a tapestry of reds, oranges, and browns, carved by the relentless forces of nature over millennia. The narrow path wound its way through the towering cliffs, the silence of the desert amplified by the enclosing rocks. Here, in this ancient corridor carved by wind and time, we were acutely aware of our vulnerability. Small shrubs and hardy plants clung to life in the crevices, their stubborn existence a testament to the harshness of this environment. We proceeded with heightened caution, the convoy tightly knit as we navigated the serpentine path. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. The soldiers were tense, their training and instincts on high alert. The atmosphere was charged, each of us braced for the unseen and the unexpected. It was about 5 minutes into the canyon when my gaze fell upon something unsettling. A kufiya, its red and white fabric barely visible against the rocky backdrop. A surge of adrenaline shot through me as I grasped the full implication of what I was seeing. Danger was imminent. I reached for the radio to alert the others, but my actions were too slow. From behind a large boulder, a figure appeared, brandishing a rocket launcher, the unmistakable silhouette of a Soviet-made Igla anti-tank system. Time seemed to slow as I watched him launch the missile, its trail zigzagging through the air towards us. I yelled a warning, but it was lost in the cacophony of the ensuing explosion. The world erupted in chaos. The force of the blast sent shockwaves through the convoy, and our vehicle, caught in the maelstrom, was violently tossed. I could hear the screeching of metal, the shattering of glass, and the shouts of my men, all melding into a symphony of destruction. The impact was like a hammer blow, throwing me against the interior of the truck. My head spun, and my vision blurred, the line between consciousness and darkness wavering precariously. As consciousness slowly seeped back into my mind, I found myself being dragged across the rugged terrain of the Syrian desert. The ground beneath me was a patchwork of coarse sand and sharp rocks, scraping against my skin with every jolt. My ears rang with the cacophony of gunfire and desperate shouts, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had preceded the ambush. When my vision finally cleared, I saw my squad members in defensive positions, their faces etched with determination and fear. They were firing towards distant shadows, figures obscured by the haze of the desert heat. We were on a slight incline, a vantage point about a mile away from the smoldering remains of our convoy. The scene was one of utter devastation. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and rubber. Scattered around the wreckage were our assailants, easily distinguishable in their eclectic mix of traditional Arabic clothing and military gear. It was apparent that we had been overwhelmed by their numbers, forcing us to retreat to this precarious position. They were systematically firing in our direction while simultaneously scavenging through the remnants of our cargo. Amongst the chaos, I noticed several of them attempting to force open the largest crate, the primary focus of our mission. With effort, I managed to get to my feet and grab my rifle, joining my squad in the firefight. I took aim at the figures surrounding the crate, my heart pounding as I squeezed the trigger. I managed to hit one, watching as his comrades hastily dragged him to cover, but they did not cease their efforts to open the crate. Mr. Jefferson, who until now had been an enigmatic presence, was actively firing beside me. Amidst the chaos, he yelled out, emphasizing the importance of preventing the crate from being opened. We concentrated our firepower, but our efforts were in vain. The assailants had managed to pry the crate half open, and what followed seemed like a nightmare come to life. The crate's door suddenly burst outward from the inside, hitting one of the attackers with such force that he was thrown several feet into the air. From within, a creature emerged. It was massive, resembling a grotesquely mutated dog, its movements a blur of deadly precision. It tore through the attackers with a ferocious rage that was chilling to witness. The beast's killing spree was brutal and swift. It lunged at one man, biting off his limb in a spray of blood. Another assailant was disemboweled within seconds, his insides spilling onto the desert sand. The air was filled with the sickening sounds of flesh being torn and bones being crushed. As the creature wreaked havoc, the attackers' focus shifted from us to the new threat. Their screams of terror mingled with the sound of gunfire as they desperately tried to fend off the beast. The scene before us was one of pure carnage, the ground quickly turning into a gruesome tableau soaked in blood. In the midst of this horror, panic set in among the bandits, and they began to flee. The creature pursued them relentlessly, its fury unrelenting. Mr. Jefferson's voice cut through our shock, urging us to move. I nodded, snapping out of my dazed state, and quickly assessed our situation. A roll call revealed the heart-wrenching cost of the ambush. Corporal Smith, always the one to lighten the mood, and Senior Lieutenant Evertley, the embodiment of stoicism, were both gone. Their absence created a void that was felt deeply by every member of our squad. Additionally, one of the government officials had been killed. Our numbers were now reduced to 8, including 2 wounded and 4 remaining government agents. I radioed for backup, receiving confirmation that help would arrive in 6 hours. Our immediate priority was to distance ourselves from the chaos and the unknown horror we had unleashed. The only remaining vehicle, an MRAP, had been rendered inoperable during our retreat. We salvaged what we could: stretchers for the wounded, essential equipment, ammunition, and, most importantly, water. In the unforgiving desert, water was as valuable as life itself. The realization that we needed to evacuate immediately was unanimous. The creature, a living embodiment of terror, posed a threat we were ill-equipped to handle. It was a force of nature, unpredictable and deadly. As we prepared to leave, the gravity of our situation weighed heavily on us. The burning vehicles behind us were a grim reminder of the day's events, a testament to the chaos we had narrowly escaped. Yet, there was no time for mourning or reflection. Survival was our only objective. I activated the GPS beacon to ensure that rescuers could locate us. With the wounded securely on the stretchers, we began our arduous journey. The desert stretched out before us, vast and unyielding, its beauty marred by the violence that had just unfolded. After trekking approximately 10 grueling miles through the rugged canyon, our weary group finally emerged onto the open desert. We trudged alongside the highway, a desolate stretch where no vehicles dared to travel. The heat was oppressive, its intensity unrelenting, as we took turns carrying our wounded comrades, our strength waning with every step. As dusk began to blanket the sky, we were on the verge of setting up camp, when a flicker of lights in the distance caught our attention. In the heart of the desert stood a solitary structure. Drawing closer, we found ourselves before an old, yet beautifully crafted Arab stone house. It was a 2-story building with a small courtyard in front, and the doors stood invitingly open, illuminated by the warm glow of lights inside. I recognized it as a typical Syrian tavern, a haven for travelers braving the desert's harshness. The house featured a central courtyard enclosed by high walls, offering a secluded sanctuary. A fountain adorned its center, surrounded by lush greenery, a serene oasis amidst the sweltering desert. We cautiously entered the courtyard, where I noticed a bell next to the door. Ringing it, we were soon greeted by the house's owner. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with a well-groomed beard and dark hair, slightly tinged with gray. His skin was weathered from the Syrian sun, giving him a rugged yet wise appearance. Dressed in traditional garb, a flowing robe and a taqiyya, he exuded a welcoming aura. He introduced himself as Muhammad. We explained our need for a room, water, and clean bandages to tend to our wounded. Muhammad's gaze swept over us, pausing briefly on the government officials. Then he nodded and soon returned with the requested items. We tended to the wounds, thankfully minor, and Muhammad then offered us a meal. The food was simple but nourishing: unleavened bread, olives, laban, a thick sour milk believed to have healing properties, and Arab sandwiches, flatbreads filled with finely chopped onion, parsley, and bits of meat. We ate gratefully and thanked our host. He nodded in response and showed us to our rooms. The government officials took one room while our squad divided among the remaining 2. Soon, a peaceful quiet settled over the house. After everyone else had drifted off to sleep, I told Lieutenant Smith, who was on watch, that I wanted to explore the surroundings. Stepping outside into the cool night air, I felt a refreshing change from the day's blistering heat. The sky was a tapestry of stars, offering a moment of tranquility. I decided to walk around the house. As I rounded a corner, I stumbled upon a small grove of trees with a well at its center. Curious, I approached the well and peered inside. It was too dark to see the bottom, so I pulled out my flashlight and shined it down. To my horror, at the bottom lay a body that had clearly been there for some time. But what chilled me to the bone was the realization that the corpse belonged to Muhammad, the tavern owner I had just met. Gripping my rifle tightly, I rushed back to the rooms. Checking on my squad first, I found nothing amiss. However, upon entering the government official's room, I was met with a shocking scene. Muhammad stood in the center, staring at one of the officials who was pointing a gun at him. As I entered, Muhammad turned his head slightly towards me, then began to shake violently. His body contorted in unnatural ways, bones cracking and reshaping under his skin. The sight was both fascinating and horrifying. First, his face elongated, the jaw stretching forward, the skin rippling and contorting as if something underneath was struggling to break free. His eyes, once warm and inviting, now glowed with a feral yellow light, deep and wild. His mouth widened, lips tearing at the seams to accommodate the growing sharp teeth that emerged, dripping with saliva. The transformation was not just confined to his face. His limbs lengthened and thickened, muscles bulging and expanding in a grotesque display of power. His fingers elongated into claws, tearing through the fabric of his traditional robe. The sound of his clothing ripping was drowned out by the guttural growls emanating from his throat. His spine arched unnaturally as coarse, dark fur sprouted all over his body, covering him in a thick, animalistic pelt. The once stooped figure of a middle-aged man was now replaced by a hulking, beastly form, towering over everyone in the room. As the transformation completed, the creature that stood before us was a terrifying sight to behold. A werewolf, a mythical being of strength and primal fury. It snarled, revealing a row of razor-sharp teeth, its eyes scanning the room with predatory hunger. The man we had known as Muhammad was gone, replaced by this monstrous entity, a creature of nightmares come to life. The official opened fire, and I quickly ducked for cover, so you don't get caught in the crossfire. The creature, now monstrous in form, lunged at one of the officials, biting deep into his throat. The others continued to fire, but their bullets seemed to have little effect. In a panic, they fled the room, leaping over me in their haste, except for one. The monster grabbed his leg, tearing into him with ferocious bites. Frozen in shock, I watched the gruesome scene unfold before regaining my senses and opening fire. Hearing the shots, the rest of my squad rushed in and joined the fray. The beast, agile and seemingly impervious to our bullets, leaped across the walls before smashing through a window and escaping into the night. Silence fell over the house, a haunting stillness that lingered long after the creature's departure. We inspected the victims of the attack, but unfortunately, they had succumbed to their injuries. Fear was evident in the eyes of every member of my squad as we looked around. We decided to barricade ourselves in a room until help arrived. According to the schedule, it should have been soon. I checked the GPS tracker. It was working perfectly. I sighed, overwhelmed by the day's shocking developments. While my subordinates were setting up inside, I decided to survey the surroundings, taking Lieutenant Smith with me. We left the house, scanning the area, aware that the creature could be lurking anywhere. The darkness was on its side. We circled the fountain, and were heading towards the exit when a person emerged from around the corner of the fence. We quickly raised our weapons. It was Mr. Jefferson. He sighed with relief upon seeing us and approached. We kept our guns aimed at him, instructing him to raise his hands. Initially surprised, he then understood the situation and complied. I asked him to state his name, and he responded. Then I asked him to say my name. His answer was correct, but we weren't sure if the creature couldn't mimic memories. Mr. Jefferson then approached us, claiming he was indeed himself. I grabbed him by the collar and demanded to know what was happening. Up to this point, I had been silent and hadn't asked him about the creature since we were in a hurry to leave the area, but now he needed to explain. He gently freed himself from my grip and, sighing, began his story. They had received a message that locals had found a strange place, something like a tomb or burial site. When they arrived, they found this creature. It was something unreal, supernatural, belonging to no known species. It lay still as if dead, but upon taking samples, they realized it was still alive. They theorized that this creature might be the very ghoul from Arabian legends. The project was quickly classified, and they set up a camp near Palmyra to study it. They conducted experiments on it, trying to understand its nature. They did everything with it, but the creature had incredible regenerative abilities. This intrigued them even more. But then they began to notice signs of the creature awakening. A finger twitched, and when one of the workers saw this, he panicked, understandably, as we ourselves had seen how terrifying the monster was. Soon, when they continued their experiments, the creature opened one eye, surveyed each of them, and then closed it again. In shock, they realized it was time to transport the creature to a more secure and fortified location. Unfortunately, the area where the camp was located was in a no-fly zone due to terrorists controlling the airspace, making it dangerous to move by air. So, they decided to transport it to Deir ez-Zor, and from there to our military base. It was decided to attract as little attention as possible and transport it with a small squad. But apparently, someone leaked information about the cargo, though they did not know what we were transporting. As he finished his story, everything fell into place. The puzzle was complete. I began to process what had happened and let my guard down. I didn't notice when someone approached us. It was the last of Mr. Jefferson's surviving colleagues. His face was frightened, and he looked around nervously. Mr. Jefferson, relieved to see him alive, said, "I'm glad you're alive, Jake," and went to pat his shoulder when Jake suddenly swung his hand, and Mr. Jefferson's head rolled onto the floor. I screamed and, raising my rifle, started shooting at the creature. Lieutenant Smith joined in, but the creature, having transformed back into the monster, swiftly jumped to the side and disappeared into the bushes. We kept fearing as other soldiers came running out, but we ceased fire. Standing in the darkness, with only the diav light from the lamps illuminating the small courtyard, we were tense, scanning our surroundings. Suddenly, the creature leaped out of the bushes from the other side, flying towards me. Lieutenant Smith, fortunately reacting in time, hit the creature's side with his rifle butt. It saved me. The creature only managed to scratch me. A thin stream of blood trickled down my cheek. The creature flipped in midair and landed skillfully on its hind legs. It then looked at us and was about to attack again when the roar of a helicopter sounded in the sky, and the lights of vehicles approached the inn. Backup had finally arrived. The creature noticed this and roared in frustration, then jumped, grabbed Mr. Jefferson's body, and disappeared into the night. We continued to shoot, but to no avail. We stood in shock, trying to digest what had happened. The realization came to me. This creature wanted to avenge those who had awakened it and experimented on it. Now it had vanished into the night, and we would likely never find it again. Story 2. The call came on a Friday. As the last rays of the sun dyed the sky in hues of crimson and gold, my partner Harry and I were navigating down an unassuming country road. This road, a winding serpent through the heart of rural America, was flanked on both sides by a juxtaposition of dense, shadowy forests and expansive, barren clearings. It was as if nature itself couldn't decide whether to embrace the wild or succumb to emptiness. Birds, a vibrant contrast to the dullness around, fluttered and danced in the air, their chirps a sporadic symphony that momentarily lifted the monotony of our journey. "Frank, what do you think they've lost this time?" Harry's voice broke the silence, his tone a mix of curiosity and weariness. I glanced at him briefly before returning my gaze to the road. "They say someone stole their horses," I replied, my voice steady despite the growing unease. And again, no signs of a break-in. It's becoming a disturbing pattern. Harry nodded, his eyes reflecting deep thought. "Let's recount. First their cat vanished, then several birds and pigs," he mused, ticking off each incident on his fingers. "How many times have our guys been out there, only to return with more questions than answers? Big Sam is convinced the owners might have a hand in these disappearances." "Yeah, it's odd, no doubt about it," I agreed, feeling the grip of the steering wheel tighten under my hands. "Well, here's our chance to delve into this mystery and unearth some truths." The farm soon came into view, a typical sight in this part of the country, but somehow different in the evening light. It was encircled by vast fields and weathered barns, standing as a sentinel amidst the rural landscape. But something about it, perhaps the way the red rays of the setting sun painted it in a bloody hue, gave it an almost oppressive atmosphere. A shiver ran down my spine as I parked the car. I stepped onto the creaking porch and rapped on the door, the sound echoing eerily in the surrounding silence. There was no response. A second knock, firmer this time, and suddenly a white blur shot out from the shadows. I instinctively leaped back, my hand reaching for the pistol at my side. It took a moment to realize that the supposed threat was just a small white dog, its fur as pale as moonlight. But its eyes, they glowed an unnatural, eerie red, like embers in a dying fire. Embarrassment washed over me as I holstered my pistol. The dog, still snarling softly, watched me with an intensity that felt almost human. It was then I noticed the speed at which it had appeared. too fast for any ordinary dog. My reaction, though initially shameful, seemed justified. Harry and I exchanged a glance, an unspoken agreement that something was amiss. It was then the owner emerged, a woman in her 50s, Lily Mitchell, her stature small but her presence formidable. Her face, marked by the trials of rural life, carried a weariness that seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. She ushered us into the living room, where her husband sat, a burly figure with a gaze as sullen as the gathering dusk. His greeting was nothing more than a curt nod before he returned to his brooding silence. Mrs. Mitchell, with an apologetic whisper, explained her husband's distant behavior and offered to guide us to the horse pen. As we walked through the house, I couldn't help but notice the walls adorned with photographs. They depicted happier times, the Mitchell family with a young man, his smile a stark contrast to the current somber mood of the house. "Who's this?" I asked, gesturing towards the photos. "Our son," Mrs. Mitchell replied, her voice barely above a whisper, laden with sorrow. "He passed away recently, a tragic hunting accident. They found his body torn apart by some wild animal. The forensic team couldn't identify the predator." Her words hung heavily in the air, a tangible presence of grief and mystery. Understanding dawned on me then, an awareness of the source of the farm's mournful aura. We continued in silence to the barns, the final known location of the missing horses. Suddenly, a chorus of barks erupted to our right. 4 large dogs came bounding towards us, their tails wagging energetically, a stark contrast to the grim atmosphere that enveloped the farm. The 4 dogs, upon hearing their owner's sharp command, reluctantly trotted back to their kennel, their tails tucked between their legs. Harry and I started with the barn, a structure that stood stoically against the backdrop of the fading day. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of hay and the ghost of animal presence. We scrutinized every corner, every shadow, but found nothing. The lock on the barn door was untouched, its integrity unbroken. It was as if the horses had dissolved into the air, leaving behind a void filled only with questions. We grilled Mrs. Mitchell about the previous disappearances. Her answers painted a pattern as predictable as it was baffling. Each evening, the animals were there. By morning, they had vanished without a trace. No signs of a struggle, no evidence of a break-in, nothing. The survey of the farm's perimeter took us through a landscape that seemed frozen in time. The fields lay barren, a stark contrast to the encroaching wildness of the forest's edge. As we walked, the farm's isolation became increasingly apparent, a lone island in a sea of untamed nature. Our path eventually led us to the forest's edge. It was here that I felt an inexplicable urge to look back. The sight that met my eyes was unnerving. The 4 Mitchell dogs stood in a line, their bodies rigid, their eyes fixed on us. There was something profoundly unsettling about their silent vigil. "It's the silence," Harry finally said, breaking the eerie calm. "It's unnatural. There's no sound of birds, no hum of insects, not even the rustle of the wind through the trees." His voice carried a note of unease that mirrored my own feelings. As I tuned into the surroundings, the absence of natural sounds was unnerving. The silence felt like a heavy blanket, smothering all signs of life. But then, a rustling noise broke the stillness. We looked up in unison to see a pair of glowing red eyes peering at us from the dense foliage. "A missing cat, maybe?" I ventured, more to break the tension than out of belief. Harry could only offer a non-committal shrug. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the creature vanished, its agile movements carrying it from tree to tree. Its identity remained a mystery, cloaked by the forest's dense canopy. We decided to head back to the farmhouse, a decision hastened by the unsettling encounter. Inside, I brought up the cat sighting to Mrs. Mitchell. She shook her head sadly, confirming it was one of the first animals to disappear. "So, all that's left are the dogs?" I asked, trying to piece together the puzzle. "Yes," she replied, a hint of sorrow in her voice. "The 4 big ones have been with us since they were puppies. And little Mabel, the white one with the red eyes, she came to us just after our son passed away. She's been such a comfort." I pressed further. "Did the dogs act differently on the nights of the disappearances? Any unusual behavior?" "No," she answered, her gaze distant. "They were as quiet as the nights themselves." With no new leads and the daylight fading, we decided it was time to leave. We thanked the Mitchells and assured them we would return with more resources. As I climbed into the driver's seat, my eyes inadvertently met those of the white dog, Mabel, her red eyes staring out from the window. The sight sent a chill down my spine, and I quickly turned the ignition. The drive back was filled with an uneasy silence. Harry was the first to break it. "That place, it's got a bad vibe, wouldn't you say?" he asked. I nodded, my mind racing. "Yeah, the owner's distant demeanor, the dogs, especially Mabel with those haunting red eyes." Then it hit me, the red eyes in the forest. A sense of dread washed over me, a premonition that we were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Without a word, I slammed on the brakes and turned the car around, heading back to the farm at full speed. "What's going on?" Harry asked, startled by my sudden decision. I didn't answer, my focus solely on the road ahead, racing back to the farm as night began to envelop the sky. The moment we arrived back at the Mitchell farm, a sense of dread washed over me. Without hesitation, I grabbed my pistol, feeling its familiar weight grounding me in the unfolding chaos. We burst into the house, our movements rapid, fueled by adrenaline and fear. The interior was silent, unsettlingly so, as if the house itself was holding its breath, bracing for the horrors that lay just beyond our sight. I made my way to the back door, my partner Harry right on my heels. The air felt thick, charged with an ominous energy that seemed to seep from the very walls of the farmhouse. As I reached for the door handle, a cold shiver ran down my spine, an instinctual warning of the nightmare that awaited us outside. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. Time seemed to slow as the scene before us unfolded in a macabre display. The four dogs, previously ordinary creatures, were now engaged in a ghastly feast upon two human bodies. The corpses were unrecognizable, torn and mangled in a way that spoke of a violence beyond comprehension. Just a few feet away from this grotesque banquet, a pentagram was crudely drawn onto the earth, its lines smeared and uneven. Around it, candles burned with a sickly light, casting long, twisted shadows that danced across the nightmarish tableau. The dogs looked up as the door swung open, their eyes glowing a demonic red. They didn't snarl or growl. Instead, they wore what could only be described as a smile, a twisted, chilling distortion of what should have been a comforting, familiar expression. The thought flashed through my mind, surreal and bizarre. Since when could dogs smile like that? Before I could process the thought further, Harry nudged me from behind. My training kicked in, and I started shooting, aiming for the monstrous canines. But they moved with an unnatural agility, darting and weaving like shadows, dodging every bullet. Harry joined in, his gunshots echoing mine, but our efforts were futile against their preternatural swiftness. Then, a searing pain shot through my leg. Looking down in horror, I saw Mabel, her mouth grotesquely enlarged, latched onto my leg. I fired directly at her, the gunshots ringing in my ears, but she seemed impervious to the bullets. In a desperate move, Harry used his taser on her, and with a final convulsive shudder, she released her grip, taking a piece of my flesh with her. She retreated, her eyes still fixed on us with an ungodly intelligence, as she slowly chewed on the flesh, emitting sounds that were anything but canine. Harry, his face pale and set in a grim line, dragged me back inside the house. He secured the door just as the dogs began to hurl themselves against it, their bodies thudding with sickening thumps. But they couldn't breach it. A moment later, a single, commanding bark cut through the air, and an eerie silence descended. Bleeding and in shock, I leaned heavily on Harry as he helped me to the car. We locked ourselves inside, the safety of the vehicle feeling like a fragile barrier against the horrors outside. As we waited for backup, the night seemed to press in around us, heavy with unseen threats. When help finally arrived, the medics immediately tended to my wound. Harry, along with the arriving officers, went back to investigate the scene, only to return with baffling news. The bodies, the dogs, the pentagram, all had vanished without a trace. The only evidence that anything had occurred was my bleeding leg. As the medic examined the wound, he voiced his confusion. "Are you sure this was a dog bite?" he asked, scrutinizing the jagged, torn flesh. "It looks more like a human or maybe a primate bite." Drained of energy and overwhelmed by the surreal events, I managed a weak response. "Well, it definitely wasn't a cat." Story 3. When I was 6, my world revolved around the simple joys of childhood. My parents, passionate about their travels, often embarked on journeys to distant lands, leaving me in the care of my grandmother. This arrangement never bothered me. I loved my grandmother dearly. She was the epitome of kindness and warmth, always ready to spoil me with her homemade treats and captivating stories, her eyes twinkling with unspoken wisdom and adventures of yore. Grandma lived in a quaint, somewhat isolated suburb, snugly situated at the forest's fringe. It was a place where the modern world seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural, a harmonious coexistence of urban comforts and untamed wilderness. The journey from our house to hers was a scenic hour's drive, winding through lush landscapes and sleepy towns, a transition from the bustling city life to the serene embrace of nature. We arrived at her abode around noon, the sun casting playful shadows through the towering trees that bordered her property. Her house, an old Victorian structure, stood majestically against the backdrop of the woods, its wooden exterior weathered yet welcoming. The porch, adorned with potted plants and a couple of rocking chairs, exuded a homely charm. There, a ginger cat, a regular fixture, lay sprawled in lazy elegance on one of the chairs. His fur glowed like burning embers under the sun's caress. As we approached, he lifted his head, regarding us with an almost discerning gaze, as if assessing our intentions. His demeanor amused me greatly, prompting me to dash towards him and engulf him in an affectionate embrace. He initially wriggled in protest, but sensing my harmless intent, he soon relaxed into my arms, purring softly. My mother's call redirected my attention, and we proceeded indoors. The moment we stepped in, the familiar scent of cinnamon and old books enveloped us, a signature fragrance of Grandma's house. The interior was a cozy collage of antique furniture, family portraits, and hand-knitted throw blankets. From the living room emerged Grandma, her smile as warm as the summer sun, her arms open in a welcoming embrace. She was a petite woman, her hair a cascade of silver waves, her face lined with the gentle creases of time and laughter. Behind her, in a peculiar procession, trailed a variety of cats. They were of different breeds and colors, some with sleek coats, others fluffy, all moving with an air of dignified nonchalance. The sight was both amusing and bewildering. I attempted to count them, my focus wavering as I reached 11. My mother, observing this feline parade, couldn't hide her surprise and inquired about their sudden proliferation. Grandma chuckled lightly, brushing off the query with a wave of her hand. She referred to them as her guests, suggesting a certain transience in their stay. Yet their comfortable demeanor around the house hinted at a more permanent residency. After my mother, with a lingering look of bemusement, had left, Grandma and I embarked on the task of feeding our furry companions. She prepared a large pot of porridge, explaining that it was both economical and nutritious for the cats. The kitchen, a realm where Grandma reigned supreme, was a warm, inviting space, filled with the aromas of spices and herbs, the walls adorned with copper pots and pans, and recipe books stacked in haphazard piles. She retrieved an assortment of bowls, 13 in total. All were identical in shape, but varied in designs, painted with intricate patterns and vibrant colors, except for one which was noticeably larger and plainer. We arranged the bowls meticulously on a long, rectangular wooden table, its surface worn smooth from years of use. The bowls formed 2 neat rows of 6, with the large one positioned solemnly at the head. Grandma, with a certain ceremonious air, took a small brass bell from the windowsill and rang it. The sound, clear and melodic, seemed to resonate throughout the house. Instantly, the cats appeared from their various hideouts, their movements swift and purposeful. Each cat, with an almost rehearsed precision, took its place beside a bowl, their eyes following Grandma's every move. The last to enter was the ginger cat from the porch. He moved with a regal, unhurried gait, his tail held high. He seated himself at the head of the table, in front of the largest bowl, and surveyed his subjects with a benign authority. As he began to eat, the others followed suit, the room filling with the soft sounds of purring and lapping. I watched in fascination, my young mind intrigued by this orderly display. Turning to Grandma, I asked if the ginger cat was their leader. She nodded, a mysterious smile playing on her lips, and said, "In a way, yes. He's more of a patriarch among them, They respect him, and he looks after them in his own way. The cats ate in harmonious silence, each waiting for their turn to approach the water bowl after their meal. Once the feeding ritual was complete, the cats, one by one, gracefully exited the kitchen, disappearing into various nooks of the house. The ginger cat lingered a moment longer, his gaze meeting mine, as if imparting some ancient feline wisdom before he too vanished into the shadows of the hallway. A week had passed in the quietude of Grandma's house, a week where the mundane began to weave with the mysterious. Aside from the ritualistic feeding of the cats, I had started to notice other peculiarities that seemed to defy explanation. The first was the scent. In stark contrast to my friend's aunt's home, where the presence of just 5 cats was announced by an unmistakable odor, Grandma's house was a sanctuary of fresh scents. It was a puzzle, given her numerous feline companions. The air was always crisp, infused with the gentle fragrances of chamomile and mint, as if the house itself was part of a vast, well-tended garden. Then, there was the ginger cat, my favored companion among the feline assembly. I found solace in his company, often engaging in long play sessions, or simply sitting with him, feeling the comforting weight of his body against mine. One incident, in particular, stood out. Walking near a house known for its ferocious dog, I found myself in a harrowing situation. The dog, upon noticing me, erupted into a frenzy of barks and leaps, managing to clear the fence and charge in my direction. My heart raced as I scrambled up the nearest tree, narrowly escaping its snapping jaws. Clinging to the branches, I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing for a way out of this predicament. It was then that I noticed the ginger cat, perched nonchalantly on a nearby branch. His presence was both a surprise and a comfort. As the dog continued its aggressive display below, something extraordinary happened. Once its eyes met with the cat's, the once fierce creature transformed. It whimpered, tail tucked, and retreated in a display of submission I would have thought impossible. I was left in stunned silence, saved by the very cat I had come to adore. This event deepened the mystery surrounding him, elevating him from a mere pet to something akin to a guardian in my young eyes. But it was not just his daytime demeanor that intrigued me. Nightly, as the clock neared midnight, he would disappear. His nightly excursions were a source of intrigue and speculation. Where could he possibly go every night with such regularity? The summer days drifted by, marked by a sense of tranquility and the comforting routine at Grandma's. However, this peace was abruptly shattered when Grandma fell ill. The doctor's visit and his advice for bed rest filled the house with a sense of urgency and concern. I noticed the cats seemed to share in this sentiment, their behavior more subdued, their movements slower, as if in respect for Grandma's condition. Then came the night when, at 11:30 p.m., the cats, as if heeding an unspoken signal, gathered and silently filed out of the house. Compelled by a mix of concern and curiosity, I decided to follow them into the night. The procession of cats moved with a mysterious purpose, forming a delicate chain as they crossed the garden and approached the rear gate leading into the forest. With agile leaps, they cleared the gate. I cautiously opened it and followed, my heart thumping in my chest. As we entered the woods, darkness enveloped us like a thick, impenetrable shroud, as if we had passed through an invisible barrier. Fear gripped me, but noticing the silhouettes of the cats starting to fade into the distance, I hurried to catch up. We traveled for what seemed like 20 minutes, the forest alive with eerie sounds that heightened my sense of foreboding. To my left, a continuous, soft, yet desperate squealing emanated, sending chills down my spine. The urge to turn back was strong, but curiosity propelled me forward. Suddenly, the dense forest gave way to a clearing. I didn't dare venture further. Instead, I concealed myself in the nearest bushes and peered out. What I saw next was beyond comprehension. The cats, standing on their hind legs in a display of unnatural agility, were dragging branches and twigs to the center of the clearing. Others were digging small pits, and I soon realized they were creating a circle with intricate patterns within it. From the opposite side of the clearing, a larger group of cats emerged, carrying a massive cauldron, seemingly filled with some unknown liquid. They placed it at the center of the circle on a bed of stones and began to pile more wood underneath. Then, a lone cat began to meow, a haunting, melodic sound that soon escalated into a chorus as the others joined in. Suddenly, as if by some enchantment, a flame ignited beneath the cauldron. A few of the cats, still standing on their hind legs, began to circle the cauldron in a dance-like motion. I glanced around and realized that the darkness had deepened, the howls and cries from outside the clearing growing more intense. As I turned my attention back to the cauldron, I could see it beginning to boil, the cats around it meowing louder and dancing more fervently, as if entering a trance. The wind picked up, howling in harmony with the sounds of the forest, the atmosphere charged with an otherworldly energy. I cowered, covering my head, yet my eyes remained fixed on the cauldron. From its bubbling depths, something began to emerge, slow and deliberate. It appeared to be a hand. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the scene before me. Was this some sort of feline ritual, a gathering steeped in ancient, forgotten lore? The cat's behavior, so at odds with anything I had ever seen or heard of, suggested a deeper, perhaps darker connection to the forest and its hidden secrets. The wind continued to howl, the trees swaying violently, as if in response to the cat's chant. The air was thick with an unexplainable tension, the boundary between reality and the supernatural blurring. The sight of the hand rising from the cauldron was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a manifestation of something ancient and powerful. The cat's dance grew more intense, their meows a cacophony that seemed to resonate with the very soul of the forest. I felt an overwhelming sense of being part of something ancient, a witness to a ritual that transcended time and understanding. The grotesque hand rising from the cauldron was slick and glistening, its long, twisted claws resembling the barren branches of a dead tree. The sight held me in a macabre trance, each second intensifying my fear. My mind raced with ghastly images of what creature could possess such a horrifying limb. The desire to flee was overwhelming, yet I was rooted to the spot, my eyes unable to tear away from the mystical scene unfolding before me. In the midst of my petrified state, a sharp sensation on my leg jolted me back to reality. Frightened, I turned to see the familiar ginger cat, his commanding presence in stark contrast to the chaos around us. He scratched insistently, then circled, a clear signal that he wanted my attention. Seemingly understanding the grave danger we were in, he gently grabbed the hem of my dress with his teeth and tugged, urging me to follow him. This act of urgency from the cat broke the spell that had been holding me captive. I slowly got to my feet, my body trembling, and began to follow him. However, the pull of the surreal ceremony was strong. I cast one final, fateful glance back at the cauldron. To my horror, more of the creature had emerged, a portion of its head, revealing a solitary, wandering eye. The eye, large and unblinking, roved around as if scanning its surroundings, assessing the ritual. I stood frozen, the sight of that solitary, ever-moving eye etching itself into my memory. The urgency in the ginger cat's behavior brought me back to my senses. I hastened my pace, following him as we retraced our steps through the foreboding forest. The night around us was alive with sinister howls and whispers, the shadows seeming to move with a life of their own. I could feel the presence of unseen creatures, their glowing eyes briefly visible before disappearing into the darkness. My heart raced with every step, but I forced myself to focus solely on the cat leading me, my beacon in the enveloping gloom. After what felt like an eternity, we crossed an invisible barrier, and the oppressive atmosphere of the forest lifted. The night, once filled with terror, now seemed almost serene under the moon's gentle glow. I collapsed onto the cool, damp grass, my body shaking from the ordeal. Lying there, the events of the night replayed in my mind like a nightmarish tapestry, while the ginger cat sat beside me, seemingly unfazed by our harrowing experience, methodically licking its paw. Once I gathered my strength, I returned home, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with haunting visions. Morning's light brought a shocking surprise. Grandma, who had been so ill the night before, was now the picture of health. Her recovery seemed nothing short of miraculous. I questioned her about the sudden change, and she replied with a nonchalance that suggested an ordinary recovery. I couldn't help but wonder if her sudden improvement was linked to the previous night's events. Eager for answers, I shared my experience with her, describing every chilling detail. She listened with a dismissive smile, suggesting it was all a figment of my imagination, a dream conjured by a worried mind. As we talked, the cats entered the room, each finding a spot to settle comfortably. The Ginger cat leaped onto my bed, his gaze shifting between me and Grandma. It was then I noticed something alarming in his eyes, a wild, hungry look that sent shivers down my spine. A terrible thought crossed my mind. What if Grandma's recovery was a temporary reprieve? What if the creature in the cauldron was still biding its time, its hunger yet to be sated? The connections between these events began to form a terrifying pattern in my head. As realization dawned, fear gripped my heart, and an involuntary scream escaped my lips.